gentlemen, and welcome to the semi-final of the Next Generation debates. My name is Oliver Hartwig, and I'm the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the Friedlander Foundation for their very generous support of this project. Michael Friedlander, who unfortunately cannot be with us tonight, has been a long-standing background supporter of many projects designed to improve public understanding of why public policy matters. And without his support, this tournament wouldn't have happened. Many thanks also to EY and Ellen Judge, who's with us tonight, for the use of this splendid venue and for generously providing us with pizza and beer to help us through this debate. The aim of this tournament is to get people, especially young people, thinking and talking about public policy issues and understanding why they matter. As most of you know, the New Zealand Initiative's mission statement is promoting sound public policies that will make for a better standard of living for all New Zealanders. To give you some background to tonight's event, university debating teams consisting of two of the top debaters from Auckland, Victoria, Canterbury and Otago universities entered the tournament, and heats were held in Auckland and Wellington high schools last week. This is our first semi-final. We have another in Wellington tomorrow night, and the grand final will be held on the 20th of August at the City Gallery in Wellington. The mood tonight is this House believes that progressive tax rates are unfair. I should hasten to explain that the position reflected in the mood is designed to make for a good debate and does not necessarily reflect the view of the New Zealand Initiative. I should also say that the teams were assigned their side of the debate with a toss of a coin. Before we begin, some quick introductions. From Otago University, arguing the affirmative side, we have Olivia Hall. Olivia is currently completing a Bachelor of Arts, majoring in Gender Studies and Politics at Otago. She's been involved in debating since high school and last year was part of the team that won the joint scroll, New Zealand's Prepared Debating Championship. Liv has also had a lot of involvement in debating admin, convening numerous tournaments, and is currently the tournaments officer on the Otago Debating Executive. Before moving to Dunedin, Liv was the Vice President of the Victoria University Debating Society. Debating with her is Alec Dawson. Alec is in his sixth and final year of a double degree in Law and Arts, majoring in politics, philosophy, and economics. He has debated throughout his time at university, attending World Championships from 2012 to 2014, and making the World's Grand Final in 2013. He has also spent a significant portion of his time at university volunteering for Generation Zero, an organization of young people campaigning for government solutions to climate change in New Zealand. He's currently planning on taking a position as a judge's clerk in the Supreme Court next year. And on the Auckland team, arguing the negative side, we have Paul Smith. Paul completed a BA in History, Politics and Philosophy at Victoria University and is currently studying honours in philosophy at Auckland. As a debater, he has twice been a semi-finalist at the Australasian Inter-University Debating Championships and attended the World Championships in Botswana in 1999. In New Zealand, he has previously won the New Zealand Impromptu Champs and was a finalist this year. He's twice been a finalist in New Zealand Prepared Champs and was the best speaker of that tournament in 2011. He also won the New Zealand British Parliamentary Champs in 2009. And with him is James Penn. James Penn is a second-year student at the University of Auckland studying Law and Commerce, majoring in Economics and Finance. He's been debating since high school, having been there to 3 World Schools Debating Championships as part of the New Zealand Schools Debating Team, which he captained in 2012 and 13. At the 2013 World Schools Debating Championships, he was ranked the 8th best speaker. Since entering university last year, he has broken to the semi-finals of the New Zealand Impromptu and New Zealand Prepared Debating Championships, and in 2013 broke in 8th place at the Australasian InterVarsity Debating Championships. Finally, our adjudicators are Wesley Horton, a junior barrister at Shorten Chambers, Mitchell Cooper, senior public policy analyst at Vodafone, and Stephanie Thompson, junior barrister at Bankside Chambers. Again, tonight's vote is this House believes that progressive tax rates are unfair, and starting for the affirmative side is Olivia.
Ladies and gentlemen, on this side of the House, we believe that many people contribute great things to our society. They find new ways to use knowledge and apply skills. They develop new technologies that go on to benefit huge swathes of our community. And we think that when they make those decisions to benefit the community in that way and make a whole lot of money in doing so, they do not deserve to be punished for those decisions. And that's what we believe progressive taxes do. We say that this is a principled debate about progressive income taxes. And while we don't think we need to provide a perfect alternative to progressive taxes. We believe that far fairer tax systems exist. Because essentially what a progressive tax system does is it means that above an arbitrary threshold, the government takes more out of every $1 you make. And we think that that is incredibly damaging. In terms of fairness, we'd give you the example of a flat tax, which we think is much fairer. It will still take more from those who make more, but there are much better incentives in place, and we don't arbitrarily increase the amount we take out of each dollar in the way we do with a progressive tax. So at the end of this debate, what we seek to prove to you is that there's no justification for taking that extra amount out of each of your dollar purely on the basis that you are making more money than some of those around you. We have 3 points that I'm going to bring to you today. The first is that we think it punishes people for good actions that they take. The second is that we think it prevents people from doing good things for society. And the third is that we actually think it's determined arbitrarily and doesn't seek to punish some of the things that we believe the negating team would prefer we punish. Let's talk firstly then about why we think it punishes people for good actions that they take. Because we'd say that we'd oppose any tax that seeks to punish someone for when they contribute things that we actually think are good. And we think that's what's happening here. Because to a certain extent, we say you always have individual autonomy. You always have some control over what happens in your life, and you can choose to go out and set out and seek goals that are going to end up making you money. And if that is the decision that you make, we think that's one that you are free to make. So no matter what your start is, we say a huge part of your success is your drive, is your goal setting, is your aim to seek out and do well for yourself in life. And we say that's absolutely fine. Those individual choices that you make and that work that you put into making those dreams or those ambitions come true may then reward you with the fact that you make more money than people who set out with other aims, with people who choose to pursue something they're very passionate about, but not something with the aim of making money. But we don't think that when the result of your choices is good, and when you successfully run a large business, or you successfully get promotions that push you over that tax threshold, that is enough to justify taking more of your income at that particular point. The second thing to say here is what I said in my introduction, which was to say that often the way that people set out and end up being pushed over that tax threshold is that they do things that are new and they do things that are innovative, and we think that's really important for the community that we live in. So we say you're particularly likely to be successful if you're an entrepreneur who creates new technologies that seek to benefit many people. We think the people who created the technology that goes into making apps for smartphones do very well because they found a new way to reach out to society. We absolutely believe you should be rewarded when the things that you do succeed in that way, and when there is a market for them, and when you are successful at marketing to that group of people. And when you do that, we say that we shouldn't arbitrarily determine that you've succeeded too much or that you have reached a point where we take more out of every one of your dollars. We say it's absolutely fine that we continue to take an equal proportion of your money, meaning we would still take more from you the more that you earn. But for every marginal dollar, we will not increase, say, 50 to 60 cents out of every dollar just because you are pushed over that arbitrary threshold. We say if you're creating new ways to make money and those are successful for you, you should be fine to hold on to the money that you then make. But the second thing to say is that we actually think it also prevents people doing good things for society. Because we think that there are things that the very wealthy people in our society contribute back which are really important, which they're less likely to do under an aggressive, progressive tax, which takes more of their money away. That's things like the fact that it's really important to have people who invest large sums of money into startups or into risky investments that otherwise people will not invest in. So when you have the very startups that develop the sort of technology that is important for all of society, that make things like accessing internet via smartphones and things like that very cheap, to make internet access available to far wider communities in our society, that's a really good thing. But those startups often don't have the backing that they need unless a very wealthy investor gives them a large pool of money. We think it's the people at the very top end of our society that often have that money that they are willing to invest in those startups. So we think those startups give a lot back to our community, and that's really important. We also think that these are the very people that often back really good philanthropic or charitable work at some stage in their career, because they recognise that they have access to those large pools of money that they can give back to a community. We don't think these people are blind to the privileges that they are given at certain times in their life, and they often seek to give back to communities that gave to them, to people that helped them out, and we think that all of those things are really important. In that sense, we think rich people do really great things for our society. And this links back to fairness, because we think it's unfair to use tax as a punishment for that success, particularly given they're doing good things. But finally, I want to talk to you about why we think a progressive tax is very arbitrary in a number of senses. The first is that we don't think it actually correlates with other things that we might seek to punish, such as privileges that people hold. So we say we don't have a privilege tax, which would seek to say you have benefits that you got through no good of your own, but purely through the lottery of birth. So a privilege tax would recognise that you have a harder lot in life if you are born as a woman of colour than you do as a white man because of prejudices that exist. But that is not who a progressive tax targets. It doesn't seek out to find those that are the most well-off in society, the people who didn't have to overcome things to get there. It simply arbitrarily determines that over a certain threshold you should have more of your money taken away. We say that's incredibly problematic when it means you're also punishing people that overcame those very prejudices to get to where they are today. So when you have overcome the fact that you were not born into a wealthy background, where you were moving through society, never having to deal with sexism or racism or any other things that we believe still hold people back in society today, we think that you are privileged in a certain way, and when you're not and you overcome that and you do really well, it's even worse that we say that despite all of that, because you've reached an arbitrary threshold, we'll take more of your money. The final thing to say is that we just don't think it accounts for other factors in people's lives. It's all very well to suggest that all the people above that certain income threshold are just fine and their money doesn't mean that much to them. But we think there's a big difference between the person who gets this progressive tax harming them when they do have swathes and swathes of money, and people who have large mortgages to pay off or who are supporting a family at any given time. We think those are two very different circumstances, and again, a progressive tax doesn't take into account those other things. Therefore, we think progressive taxes are arbitrary in the people that they target. They seek to punish people for success. We think there are far fairer ways to deal with tax.
Even in our own little world of debating, where we like to think that we are pretty fair individuals, that we reward hard work and provide an accessible sport for people to enjoy, only 3 of the last 25 speakers selected for the New Zealand Schools debating team have been from Decile 5 schools or lower. It's not because those people worked less hard than those from Decile 5 and above schools. It's because they are afforded less opportunity and less support from the people and the systems around them. It is the case of the proposition today that when the same thing is true for income, when the same effects and lack of opportunity affect the income you enjoy, that the state should step in and should correct for that, and progressive taxes are an excellent and fair way of doing so. 3 points from this opposition. First, why progressive taxes provide a desirable correction for natural inequality that exists in this world. Second, that progressive taxes that it's fairer for the rich to pay more tax to provide necessary services that the state must always provide. And finally, that progressive taxes acknowledge the fact that some people disproportionately use and benefit from the investments that the state and the community makes. Let's first take a look at what we heard from Liv. The first thing she told you was progressive taxes punish good actions. The first thing to say here is that we are not punishing, and that would indicate that we're just taking the money and throwing it away, but rather we're reallocating it, and so we would say that it's not a punishment in the same way we generally deem that word to be used. Moreover, we would say that that is also an argument against flat taxes in general, because when they support flat taxes, they also support you paying more money than other individuals because you are earning more money than other individuals, which was precisely the logic Liv used to oppose progressive taxes. But we would more importantly say that this argument relies on 2 premises. The first was all Liv's discussion about these people working much harder than other individuals who are poorer than them. We're going to prove to you in our case that there are other far more significant factors that are likely to affect your income. But the second premise was that these people are doing really good for society. We would suggest that in many cases, that is simply not the case. And this cuts to the heart of the mischaracterization that Liv's second point made about discouraging innovation. The vast majority of people that we impose progressive taxes on aren't the Steve Jobs type figures in society. Rather, they're people who have just gone to university, got a law degree because they can afford it, or they've had a school that's enabled them to do so, and aren't contributing anything very meaningful to society. The fact that a lot of these individuals that we tax a huge amount are simply patent trolls or people who buy up or people who bought up a lot of internet domains at the start of the .com era doesn't mean that those people are contributing hugely great things to society. That premise was false. Finally, she said it's arbitrary. Well, we would also support privilege taxes in some situations, but we would say two things in relation to that. The first is that often those are incredibly politically unpalatable and impossible to impose. And so we think progressive taxes are a similar and much more feasible opportunity for us to do the same thing. But we'd also say it's easier to measure the outcomes of privilege because there are often a range of factors, right? So if we imposed a privilege tax on all white people, that would not account for the fact that a lot of white people do come from incredibly poor backgrounds and don't have all that privilege that they wanted to indicate. So we think that measuring the outcomes is more effective than measuring the very blunt, but than using the very blunt tool of measuring some of the starting points. On why progressive taxes provide a desirable correction for natural inequality. There are huge amounts of societal reasons as to why you become richer than the vast majority of other people in society. The fact that you are born into a household with more income, that you are born into a household in a particular area of a community and therefore can go to a better school, the fact that your parents are more likely, if you come from a higher income family, to support you in outside of the formal education you get, the fact that if you are born into a particular race, you are less likely to be discriminated against in employment matters, all affect the likelihood of you receiving that high income that they say it's unfair to penalise. We would say further that there are often inherent individual traits that affect the likelihood of you earning a high income. Your IQ, your natural attractiveness, your natural people skills that you are born with, that no one in many, or that there's a very small degree of control over, and ultimately do go towards affecting your income. All things that Liv ignored in her speech, and we would say are unfair things that we should measure people's outcomes in life based on and reward them on the basis of. We would say that while hard work does contribute somewhat to the income you have, these factors are overriding and often place higher barriers to some people in terms of achieving higher incomes and make it far easier and provide springboards for other people to earn higher incomes than the vast majority of society. Progressive taxes recognise that and say it's fair that we shouldn't measure, or that we shouldn't allow outcomes to be dictated by starting points, that we should go some way towards correcting for those. Secondly, to provide for necessary services, it's fairer for the rich to pay more. The first thing to understand here is that often the state has a desire, the first thing to understand is that there's just a lot of general simple things that the state has to do, such as providing a system of law, such as enforcing that law. And these things, regardless of the level of state control you want, have to exist and have to be paid for. We would say in situations, the second thing we would say is that often the state also has to do things like trying to break down those social conditions which affects the ultimate income you get. And the state has to pay for those things by doing things like funding education, like providing access to capital in poorer areas. A flat tax either reduces the revenue you have to be able to do that, or it imposes a comparatively higher burden on the poor. We would say that, first of all, the rich are more able to pay for that and more able to shoulder that burden, but also the marginal utility they gain from the $100 you are taking away from them is far lower than the marginal utility that someone receiving that $100 gains when they are from a very poor background. So in that sense, we would say that makes these progressive taxes and tax system much, much fairer. Finally, progressive taxes acknowledge the fact that some people, the rich, disproportionately use and benefit from the investments of the state. If you are a high-income individual, the chances are you have benefited hugely from the roads that the state funds by using the transport networks that allow your business to survive, from the rule of law and courts you use to enforce your ability to partake in that business, from the police protecting the larger scale of property that you own, from the telecommunications infrastructure that allows your business to continue to operate. All things that the state has invested in historically and continues to do so today. Progressive taxes say that when you take more from a system, you ought to pay more back to that system. In the same way that when we take more from private businesses, we have to pay more in order to receive those. Progressive taxes understand the inequality that exists in society. They empathise with people in a way that the market cannot, and ultimately they go some way to correcting in a way that the market does not. So proud to oppose.
One of the things James wanted to bring up to defend the progressive tax system was that it's relatively easy in our administrative system to manage a progressive tax system. Yes, our tax system is based upon a balance of a number of different criteria. One of those criteria is administrative easiness, one of those is fairness. But if you're going to have a system that trades off those different values, don't call it one that is solely fair. Because we say on this side of the house that a progressive tax system might be easy to administrate, but it is an unfair one. And that in pointing out that it is unfair, it actually helps with trying to improve that tax system. Because over time, we can aim for something better, because we think that's possible, and we think we'll come up with one that's fairer. There are two questions in this debate, and I'm going to integrate most of my rebuttal in them. The first is whether or not a progressive tax system is the best mechanism we can come up with for making up for problems in equality of opportunity. We say it doesn't, and therefore it's arbitrary. And secondly, does a progressive tax system punish people for doing good things? We absolutely say it does, however much James wants to belittle lawyers and people with law degrees. But first, I'm going to point out a very important point in this debate, which is that it's important to notice the difference between something that makes rich people pay a bigger share of the tax burden and one that actually punishes people for being rich. Because we say that a flat tax would be fairer. And a flat tax does actually make rich people pay more money into the tax system because they earn more, they're paying the same amount per dollar, but they earn more dollars overall, more taxes go to the government. But under a progressive tax system, at the point at which you cross a threshold of earnings, you're actually paying more out of each dollar that you have earned into the tax system. So for each dollar, you're paying an additional amount. That is punitive. You're paying an extra amount solely because you're wealthy. And therefore, it's on the negative team to stand up and not just say why rich people should actually pay more money overall, why they should actually have to pay more for every dollar they earn. So why then do we say that actually it's arbitrary? And they stood up here and said, oh, well, there are lots of reasons you don't choose where you get to solely. There are lots of barriers that lots of people face. A great example of that is the New Zealand school surveying team for some reason. But we stood up and we already gave you a whole lot of reasons why that doesn't work. We say that a progressive tax doesn't actually correlate perfectly with taxing people's privileges or the reason they've got where they are. And we can see that when we look around us at the people that have managed to conquer the barriers that exist for them and get further in society. And actually there's a significant group of people that have done it. A great example is actually second-generation immigrants in New Zealand whose parents have come into the country and then they've pushed their children to work hard, they've got good degrees and they've done better than those people that came before them. There are a really significant set of people in this country that have managed to fight against those privileges and get further. That means that those people that really have earned their way, and over and above earned their way in our society because they've fought against discrimination, are getting punished by the fact that there is a progressive tax system charging money. We say that it is hugely unfair on those individuals, and therefore you can say that it's important. We've secondly told you that choice really, really matters when it comes to those decisions, and that at any stage of your life, no matter what level of privilege or disadvantage you've got, you can make decisions to try and further your way in your life. And we say that this actually punishes the people that have made those positive decisions, that they're going to go out there and do better. We say that that's a problem. We say that there are other tax systems that could be administered. You could tax people on the basis of the privileges that they have or of the relative advantage and disadvantage that they have. They tried to stand up here and say that that's administratively difficult. As I told you, that it may be more administratively difficult, but if you're going to choose a system that's easier for a government to administer, don't call it fair. Admit that it's unfair and admit that you've got other principles you're standing for. But we say that you have to call it unfair in that instance. The second thing they can try and stand up and say in that instance is to try and say, well, because it perfectly correlates, because your income perfectly correlates with the advantage that you had at the start of your life, essentially freedom of choice doesn't exist in this country, which we outright reject. And if they're right, and all people's incomes are determined by the amount of advantage they had when they were children, you might as well have a 100% tax rate on all wealth and then redistribute it according to the amount of wealth or the amount of advantage or whatever we wanted to determine it by. We say that a progressive tax rate doesn't even solve that problem. But secondly, we gave you another reason why it was arbitrary that they never wanted to deal with, which is that it doesn't actually cater to the individual needs of people who might earn different incomes. Because let's remember that in New Zealand, our progressive tax system doesn't actually just kick in at the point where you're really, really wealthy. It actually kicks in for middle-income people as well, who already at that point have to pay more out of every dollar. So it affects lots and lots of people, the punishment that's occurring. And it simply doesn't take into account the fact that you might have different needs, that a person who's more wealthy might actually have different needs to a person who's less wealthy. So if you're a middle-income person, but you have to support a significant family, you actually might be more punished by the tax system than a person who's slightly poorer than you, but doesn't have to worry about a family. It's like the difference between a middle-aged person who's supporting their family and a young, recent graduate who's earning a decent income. It may be a lower income than that middle-aged person, but actually the needs of that middle-income person is higher. The tax system simply doesn't take into account those needs, and we say that for that reason, it's also arbitrary. But secondly, we wanted to stand up and tell you that not only is it an arbitrary system, which isn't administered according to what people need or where people have started out in their lives, but also punishes people for doing good things. And we stood up and told you quite a lot of stuff here. So when people are earning high incomes, there's lots of good reasons for that. Often it's just pure hard work, which we say is a pretty good thing that we want to recognise as being good. But secondly, it's often through good innovation, through applications of knowledge or creating new kinds of ideas. And they try to stand up here and say, oh, well, most of the rich people in our society aren't innovators. They're actually like terrible people that are just rode in, like lawyers who are, aren't actually good for the world. Well, firstly, we think if you want to run a progressive income tax system effectively, you need lawyers to do that. So we suggest that you look at how our system works and recognise that lawyers are pretty important and it's pretty good to do. And secondly, James, you think you can cruise through your law degree, well, it's all very well standing there in second year thinking that, but I can tell you, having done 6 years of a law degree, it's pretty hard at times, and you might want to think about having to actually work hard. So we say that those lawyers, those accountants, that bureaucracy that's staring back at me from this audience, you guys are great. We think you actually do contribute to the society that we live in. But secondly, we actually brought you additional analysis that he did not bother to respond to, was that a progressive tax system actually targets people who are already wealthy. So it doesn't just target you for becoming wealthy and earning an income, but then it targets you people who are wealthy and says that they're bad in and of themselves. We say that that's bad because wealthy people are actually good for society. They're the people who invest and take risks in startups that actually allow those innovators and those entrepreneurs who haven't yet become rich to become rich by doing those good things for society. They produce things like these smartphones, which may just be good for me as a timer, but for some people in the world are the only way of accessing the internet. And we say that that's done great things for those people's lives. But they also come up with other forms of innovation, like innovative forms of philanthropy, where they go outside what the government's thought of doing for people and actually think of new ways to raise people out of those disadvantaged scenarios that we accept exist. We say that we can try and have a better tax system, a system that is fair and a system that works for everyone. And for these reasons, we propose.
Alec is absolutely right. You guys like that? You're doing good things for the world. You're going to go home, you're going to continue to do your jobs, you're going to continue to pay the taxes that help other people have their houses and help other people get their educations. You are good people. But the bad news is, the incomes you get at the end of the day aren't all yours and aren't all deserved by you. Now, I'm sorry to have to deliver that news yet again, but it's never been our case that you don't deserve any of it. And it's never been our case that you don't deserve any reward. Heaven forbid we give you a reward in the progressive tax system. We only take part of the extra money that you earn, and the rest of it you get to keep. And that's why all of the examples like Google and Apple and Twitter they want to bring up exist under systems of progressive taxation. Because there's always an incentive to get richer or wildly richer. And yes, it's true. You might not, if you found Google, you might not get the 40th mansion under a progressive tax system, whereas you would under a flat tax system. But you get the first 39, and we think that's pretty fine. If you're a doctor, you might not get 7 bedrooms, but you get the first 5, and we also think that's fine. We think there exist systems of reward in a progressive tax system because we're not taking 100% of income. So there's always incentives to do good. And every person, in every example of doing good they provided was one that's happened under a progressive tax system, one that we stand for, and one that recognises just because you found Facebook, or just because you found Twitter, or just because you were born into a family that paid for a private school education that got you to university and got you an easier ride in life, doesn't mean you get to keep all of your money. I'm going to talk about, first of all, whether it's a punishment. Then I'm going to talk about whether, like the nature of alternatives, whether we have to have a perfectly fair one in order to have any kind of fairness, and then finally talk about whether rich people can still do good. Hint, we've already shown you there exist reward systems. That point will be pretty short. In terms of whether it's a punishment, there's an assumption there. In calling it a punishment, you're assuming that you're taking away something that someone deserves. That's the moral assumption they've got in there. There's not a punishment if you're taking away something from someone that they don't deserve, that they haven't earned entirely. So we rejected that assumption right from the start. So when you're saying it's harsh on you when we take more money off you proportionally than on other people, the assumption underlying there is that if you're getting punished, it's because you otherwise deserve that money. We've told you there are reasons why that's not the case. Well, the first reason is that they also don't believe in their own principle when they say that they stand for a flat tax which takes more money in real terms off people who are richer. If it's true those people are doing good, then wouldn't you lower the tax and have a flat fee for governments rather than having a flat tax? But secondly, we never really understood the idea that not 1 cent more than what other people are paying naturally was unfair. Because we told you that there are all sorts of things that affect on how the kind of incomes that people have. Because all they could say was it's about individual agency and choice, and it's about people's decisions. And at first, it was as if there were no poor people who had generational issues with poverty. But at second, they said, well, even if you're born into a terrible family, you can always decide, you can always do something. But the point is, If you're born into a kind of situation where you're the kind of person who, for intrinsic reasons to do with intelligence or to do with sociability, life is harder, you're going to have less income than someone else who was born in the same position relative to you. So at that point we say that there are all these factors which affect the distribution of income, which mean that people aren't being taxed fairly if they're not being taxed progressively. We gave you a range of examples, right? Because the reason you're getting high income in the first place, the reason why you have that, is not just because of your hard work and your talent, it's because of the factors about how you were born intrinsically, the kind of traits you have, your level of intelligence and sociability, but also the household that you were born into. And the responses from that side of the house weren't to take this head on, weren't to say that you, even given these, you deserve the income you're getting. Because when we were talking about fairness, we were saying it's simply unfair that these kind of advantages tend to give you higher incomes. And at that stage, you shouldn't stand up and say, well, I've earned every damn dollar. You should recognize that you haven't earned all of that because there's been all sorts of things given to you, all sorts of things you were born into, which means that you don't automatically deserve the entirety of your income. And that's why it's not a punishment, because you never necessarily deserved it in the first place, because the kind of things that gave you that high income aren't equally distributed and aren't fairly distributed at birth. So what's the next point? They said, well, regardless of that, you should be rewarded. You are rewarded if you are a doctor. You're rewarded much more than someone who collects garbage. Right. You're rewarded if you found Google. You're rewarded if you do all of the kind of things they want to talk about. We simply deny that there's a problem with reward in this debate because a progressive taxation system doesn't go, if you earn $1 over 100 grand, it's 100%. A correct progressive taxation system simply takes more from the person who's earning a doctor per dollar than it would from the garbage man in recognition of the fact that person not only has probably had an easier ride in life, but secondly, is not as worse off if you take the money from him than from the garbage man. In terms of unfair alternatives, this is a bit of a strange point. They said that, well, if there are things that play into the kind of income you get, and we can't tax them, therefore no tax system can be fair if it's progressive. Look, just because we can't intervene in some areas and precisely calculate rates of privilege or your privilege vis-a-vis someone else and how that's affected your income, doesn't mean that a broad progressive taxation system isn't fair, because otherwise it's kind of self-defeating. Otherwise the only thing they want from us is to basically perfectly tax every single individual person relative to the rate of privilege or ease their life was. We don't think it's we don't think that's what necessarily constitutes a fair system. It might be the absolute fairest, but it doesn't deal with the philosophical points underlying what we've made, which is that it's relatively more fair to recognise that people who have an easier run in life ought to be taxed more because they don't deserve every dollar that they've earned. So we don't think the idea that we could be fairer if we went crazy and started invading everyone's personal space to try to figure out exactly how much privilege they had, etc., then we don't think necessarily means it's by virtue unfair. The next response was, we just have to be consistent. We don't think we absolutely have to. We can accept an imperfect progressive tax system that is relatively more fair than your kind of idea, so we don't think that's the burden that lies on us. Furthermore, we told you that even if it's a little bit unfair in the sense that people might, even if it's true that people deserve every dollar they get, we recognise that there's a moral demand to provide for everybody. Someone has to pay for it. This was James's point about marginal utility. He made it like an economist. Let me make it like a philosopher. The point is here, that if you're very rich and we take a little bit more money from you, then that harms you less because you can't afford the best brand of ice cream that week. That harms you less than if you take that money disproportionately from someone who's poorer. Why does that end up happening? Well, if you have a flat tax and you need to raise the amount of income the government has, that affects everybody. And you're going to have to raise that flat tax, you have to raise the tax on people on lower incomes because you've just cut out all of the money you got from people on higher incomes. So we think that the relative effect of taxation means that you're actually you're worse off if you get taxed more if you're poor than if you're rich. So we're not going to sit here crying about executives from Google who can't afford their fourth yacht, or doctors who can't afford COVID road ice cream every single night. Lastly, on this idea of doing good, they told you that companies do good. Startups like Twitter, Facebook, Google, etc., all companies that exist now on a progressive taxation system. We reject the idea that there's no incentive to do good, there's no incentive to innovate, because you can still accrue wealth under a progressive taxation system, just not as much. We're happy with that. Finally, in terms of donating to this idea of donating to being like a wealthy donor and giving money to charity. Yeah, some people might do that under a progressive taxation system already, so there's still incentives to do it. But wouldn't it be better if all people were forced to do that, to donate to a good, right, which is helping out poorer people, and through a redistributed taxation system. So we don't accept that the idea that some people donate money means that a progressive taxation system is unfair. We're happy to stand in opposition.
By Alec, the case from them was pretty clear. They said that a progressive tax doesn't correlate perfectly with taxing privilege, therefore it is unfair. Let me be clear, a lack of complete fairness does not constitute something being unfair. If we can approximate to some degree privilege that occurs or privilege that you are afforded in terms of the outcomes that you arrive at in society. And you can do that better than trying to find out every possible element of privilege that a person is born with, aggregating that, averaging it, and then applying a tax rate on everyone on the basis of that. Then maybe we would support that. But because we can't practically do that, or to do so would be politically unpalatable, then we have to move to something that is the best approximation. That is progressive taxes. Because it is not the idyllic system, does not mean that it is unfair. It may mean that there's a slight absence of fairness. It does not constitute something being unfair. Two questions at the end of this debate. The first is to ask the simple question about the extent to which the additional rewards you gain from being rich and earning a high income are purely yours, or the extent to which the community has contributed to those, or random factors of life. And the second question is what the answer to that question means for whether or not a progressive tax system is punitive or fair, and a couple of other considerations about alternatives. On the first question, the extent to which additional rewards are purely yours. This side of the House wanted to say that the overriding elements were hard work and ingenuity. The first thing to say here is that they never responded to what we told you about how often there are natural inherent factors which affect things like ingenuity. Your intelligence, your IQ that you are born with, that you have literally no control over, affects the likelihood that you will be that ingenious individual who comes up with a particular innovation or stumbles across the next Facebook. So there, in that situation, it's often very random, and it's just a fact of chance whether or not you are those individuals earning the high incomes. But in terms of working hard, what we were never saying was that lawyers and other administrative individuals in the economy don't work hard. What we were saying was they come from a starting point where their working hard gets them a higher income than someone who works hard from a lower starting point. So if you are someone who comes from an incredibly poor background and you work the same level of hardness as someone who goes to a really good school and has their parents pay for university for them, you're likely to, even if you work just as hard as them, you're likely to have a lower income. So therefore it was arbitrary to just allow those people to accrue more and more income than other individuals that work just as hard as them. We told you that other factors such as race, such as your IQ, such as your attractiveness, such as the chance of meeting someone who will give you a job in a particularly wealthy law firm, all affects the likelihood of earning a higher income. And all of these arbitrary factors which affect income should be corrected for, and the best way to do that is to tax that income progressively. We told you about also the contribution of the community to your ability to earn this income. The community provides the infrastructure, and those who earn higher incomes disproportionately utilize and benefit from that infrastructure that the community provides. Therefore, they should pay a bit more back in recognition of that fact. Absolutely no response to that point from the proposition in this debate. What does all that mean for whether this is punitive or fair? The first thing to acknowledge is that we told you right down the line, or down the two people, that the progressive tax system still enables people to be rewarded for doing good things in society. If you are rich, if you innovate and create the next Facebook, you still earn so much more and have a far better life than everyone else in society. But a progressive tax system says that some things affected your ability to do that, made it easier for you to do that. Therefore, proportionally, it's not punitive for you to pay a little bit more. And also that doing that increases our ability to make other people have the opportunities that you had to create the next Facebook later on in life. They said it doesn't acknowledge the needs of families. A progressive tax system is precisely what provides for programs such as working for families, and increases the ability of the state to provide for the needs and circumstances of all individuals in society. I am so proud to oppose this motion.
The one time I totally agreed with the negating team was when they talked about how in many ways society is still an unfair place. That is true. But all those arguments point to are that we should seek to make society as fair as possible. We should seek to even out the playing field. But we can do that in many ways, and it doesn't have to be through a progressive tax system. This is looking for the fairest tax system possible, and we do not believe that a progressive tax system is that. We don't care about the administrative cost of seeking out to tax someone the amount that they deserve to be taxed based on the privileges that were awarded to them at birth. We are perfectly happy to say that would be a fairer system. And most importantly, what they never wanted to acknowledge is that there are people who are born without those privileges who overcome that. They are these second-generation immigrant families that move here. They are the women of colour who rise through the ranks in the face of racism and in the face of sexism, and you punish those people as well when they reach that arbitrary threshold by punishing them for that success. We don't want to punish any of those people for that success. We're proud to stand in proposition. 2 points. I want to talk about arbitrariness and I want to talk about punishment. Firstly, let's look at arbitrariness. We told you from the very outset that we do not believe the progressive tax system is ever going to directly correlate with the very privileges they were so concerned with. They were very, very concerned at James with the fact that you will face racism in society and the fact that you will face sexism in society, and all of these things are arbitrary. They're right, they're arbitrary, so we should seek to correct them in the most effective way possible, and this is not it, because there will be people without those privileges who are still being harmed by a progressive tax system, and we think that's really damaging. So we would seek to look to actually correlate our tax system with privilege. We don't think that's what happens here. But more importantly, and something they never dealt with on that side of the house, is we talked to you about the differences of people that are harmed by a progressive tax system. Alex told you about the fact that in New Zealand it kicks in at quite a middling level. It affects a whole lot of people in very different circumstances in their lives. We were never only talking about the CEOs of Facebook and Google. We're talking about people who go to work every day as a lawyer, but are also seeking to raise a family and pay off a mortgage. We think that those people are very harmed by a progressive tax system. You punish them for the success that they have achieved, regardless of the privilege they hold, and they are in a much worse position. We don't think they ever dealt with that. Secondly, then, what did we tell you in terms of punishment? We told you it is a punishment because above a certain level, we take more out of every one of your dollars, and that is a punishment to you as a person for being a wealthy person. But we told you that's particularly unfair in the face of the way that many of those people contribute to society. The fact that they invest back into the economy. The fact that they innovate in many ways that they can do because they have the money. The fact that they invest in startups that otherwise would never get off the ground and benefit huge amounts of society. The fact that many of them do contribute to charity in a number of ways. We say, sure, that incentive may still exist to do some of those things, but this is a debate about fairness, and it certainly isn't fair to suggest to those people that when they've used their initiative and done all of these things, they should be punished for that. What did they tell you? Paul told you, but we don't take all of it. It's fair because we give you some of it, and that's fine. We say this is about fairness, and fairness is not taking substantially more from some people out of every dollar when it's just no reason to do so. But moreover, it comes back into the idea they never wanted to deal with, which is that it doesn't account for the different people that exist and are harmed by a progressive tax system. Then they told you that you can't practically tax privilege, and they thought that was what we were pointing for. We'd go for any system that we think is fairer than a tax system that is progressive. So we said a flat tax is actually fairer because at least we're only taking the same amount out of every dollar that you earn. That is still a fairer system than this. But moreover, if that's true, if all the issue is with taxing privilege is that it's administratively difficult, at least admit that you think that's a fairer system, because it sounds like that's what they think. If that's the very fairer system, then you should at least acknowledge that the system we're using currently isn't truly a fair one. At the end of the day, we think that people benefit from the wealth they make, but that they get there through a whole lot of work on their own. And they're not acknowledging the many, many people who have overcome obstacles to get there in the process. They don't deserve to have more of their money taken away just because they reach an arbitrary threshold.
Thank you to both our teams from Otago and University of Auckland for a very spirited debate. I must say that I expected many things, but not the lectern being thrown at me. But that was very effective, special effects, so thank you very much. We now have time for the adjudicators to come to their verdict, and they will take about probably 15 minutes to reach their conclusion. I would ask the debating teams to take a seat in the audience, and I would like to ask our commentators for tonight to join me on the panel. We have two commentators tonight to add their perspective on the topic of the debate, and the commentators are Roger Partridge, who is the chairman of the New Zealand Initiative, and in his side job also the chairman of Bird Valley. He's a lawyer, so I think he'll have a special perspective to add. And we'll have Julian Darby, a consultant at Coastal Investments, but also Julian is one of the co-conveners of the University of Auckland Economics Group, and tries to introduce good economic ideas to students from all sorts of different faculties. So I ask Roger and Julian to join me on the panel now. We'll Julian and Roger for about 5 minutes. Afterwards we'll have time for Q&A. So without further ado, Roger, Julian.
When it comes to economics, most people tend to think of the economy has been about fundamental antagonisms between different groups, between capital and labour, between business people and workers, between common people and the bourgeoisie, between high-income earners and low-wage workers, between New Zealanders and foreigners. Sound familiar? It's as if life is a war of all against all, that the rich eat us, so we should eat them first. It's basic class warfare, a collectivist habit of thought inspired by Marxism and its doctrine of class conflict. And nowhere is this doctrine of class conflict more evident than in calls for progressive taxes. Business people are simply growing rich at the expense of workers, it is claimed. So we need confiscatory taxation to prevent this. You have heard some of those arguments tonight. It's a view that ignores the greatest lesson economics can teach us, that in a society making peaceful cooperation possible, there is a harmony of interests between all of us, irrespective of how others might divide us or label us. Fact is, we all get better together. In an unhampered division of labour society, that fact quickly becomes self-evident. Progressive taxation kills the golden rule. In fact, as citizens from Venice to Venezuela discovered, it is the poorest, most vulnerable members of society that suffer the most from such regimes. Why is this? Put simply, it's because progressive taxation disproportionately reduces the amount of capital in an economic system. And any reduction in the amount of capital reduces everyone's standard of living, just as surely as if the capital was consumed in an earthquake. And this was the insight of two leading theorists of capital from the 19th and 20th centuries, Eugene von Barwick and Ludwig von Mises. Capital, you see, is the accumulated wealth owned by businesses and individuals. It consists of farms, factories, machines, tools, and more. It is accumulated on a foundation of saving, or what is left of saving after the government has taken what it thinks is its fair share. And it is capital, if allowed to accumulate, that raises the standard of living of us all, from the richest capitalist to the poorest worker. How so? There are two reasons for this. First, it is capital that pays wages. And these 6 words are so important they're worth repeating. It is capital that pays wages. It is therefore in the interest of everyone, especially the unemployed, that business people are allowed to accumulate as much capital as possible. Capital makes it possible to pay wages to workers. Less capital, poorer workers. More capital, more workers, and commensurately higher money wages. Second, capital increases the productivity of labour. It leverages human effort. In other words, it allows us to produce more stuff and quicker progress is allowed. Anyone who's seen the progress of the Waterview Tunnel will understand how the tunnel boring machine has made the whole project faster and safer than it could ever have been using human tunnellers. This greater productivity from greater use of capital leads to more goods being available at increasingly lower prices. That's great for everybody, but especially the poorest members of society. More capital increases their real wages. Despite what Karl Marx says, capital is not in conflict with labour. Economic progress over the last 300 years and the spectacular rise in living standards is really a storming of the harmony, of the deepening of division of labour, of increased saving and capital accumulation, of steadily increasing real wages right across the map. It's a great story, or would be if it were allowed to continue unimpeded. Progressive taxation is just one barrier amongst many that impedes this advance and undermines the standard of living of everyone. That hardly seems just or fair. And yet there remains significant ignorance even within the economics profession about the role of capital, and a deep hostility to those who have it. Take Thomas Piketty, the neo-Marxist French professor, whose best-selling book Capital in the 21st Century calls for wealth taxes as high as 80% to impede the accumulation of capital. Astonishingly, in a book with capital in its title, Piketty has no notion of how capital works to improve real wages. Little wonder, because as Professor George Briesman points out, there is not a single reference in Piketty's book to Eugene von Barwick and Ludwig von Mises, the two leading theorists of capital. There are, however, 70 references to Karl Marx. We should not elect to share this ignorance. As people interested in economics and public policy, we must resolve to rediscover the important lessons of the past and, in this context, become not advocates of eating the rich, but advocates of capital accumulation and saving. That will help improve the standards of everyone. And that, to me, is something that is unquestionably fair and just. Thank you.
So I think over a disclaimer why I am a lawyer, and I do work hard every day. And it's a long time since I was last in a debate. It would have been in the 1970s when it was just the rock musicians that smashed their equipment on stage. Things have changed. Anyway, so income tax and progressive versus fair, flat. It's progressive versus fair. Jumping into a tax debate about whether a particular form of tax should be either progressive or flat is a very fine point, I think. It's a really fine point. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, not a deductively straightforward one, but there are a few principles that we can follow. Economic theory will tell us. And when it comes to economics, philosophy and law, I think both philosophy and law are really sub-branches of economics. So some points for definitive there. Income tax is also a relatively modern invention. It didn't come about in the United States until the 1860s. It was introduced as a temporary tax in the Civil War. It didn't occur as a permanent tax in the US until 1913, when the 16th Amendment was needed for that. It didn't arrive in New Zealand for 30 years after it was first introduced in the US, and it arrived here in the Liberal Party in 1892. Introduced income tax with progressive rates. And it was set, you were exempt from tax if you earned less than £300, which is about 50% of the population, and the rate was set at a maximum of 5%. The question for today's debate also assumes that the big question for taxation is progressive versus flat when it comes to income tax, but it's nowhere near as clear-cut as that. There are a raft of other taxes, and the big debate, one of the debates we're going to have this election, is whether we should have a capital gains tax. That's actually not really as straightforward as that even. It's not just a capital gains tax, it's just a capital gains tax on realised capital gains. Perhaps the flattest and fairest tax, in the sense of everybody being treated in the same way, would be a poll tax or a head count tax. Now, of course, a flat tax isn't fair in the sense that people are treated differently, because, as both sides pointed out, the more you earn, the more you pay. A debate about progressive versus tax also assumes that we accept tax as a necessary constraint on our economic freedom. And perhaps that's not a bad assumption, because all but the most ardent libertarians would say that we need tax, because no matter how you combine ideas of individual autonomy, voluntary exchange and property rights, you need a state to pay for the institutions necessary to protect them. And so if you need the state to pay for the institutions necessary to protect those important values, you need to find a way to fund it. And that's where we come to the question of tax. I think designing the optimal tax system is a complex one, and it's primarily a consequentialist one. It needs to be a system that works. And it needs to be one that doesn't produce perverse incentives, and one that's efficient, and one that's widely accepted as fair by those who pay the tax. Because if they don't, it won't be enduring. And I think that's where this concept of punishment is a slightly odd one, because no part of the tax system should be to punish. It's to produce income that will pay for the mechanics of the state that we need to enable us to function as a viable society. Of course, the taxation system must also be consistent with the underlying values it's seeking to protect, and so it would be morally unfair if tax was levied just on a select few. So it's got to be widely accepted by those who pay it. And if it's just a select few that are going to be taxed, then it won't be effective, because human capital is mobile unless you live in Northern Korea. And that's why the French have seen in recent years their financial services industry depart from France to London and New York, as Francois Hollande proposes a cap on incomes in the financial services sector. Human capital is mobile. If you tax people too much, they'll vote to leave. As many rock stars, not so much the guitar smashing ones, but as many rock stars did in the early 1970s. In Britain, George Harrison became a tax exile. The marginal rates of tax in the UK in the 1970s for the very rich exceeded 100%. If we're talking just about the case for and against a progressive tax, then I think economics doesn't give us a deductively right or wrong answer. And even the most ardent advocates of a flat tax, the likes of Milton Friedman and Frederick Hayek, both contemplate a tax-free threshold, which introduces a progressive element. So you've got progressivity even with a flat tax structure. However, there is a lot of evidence in economic theory about the advantages and disadvantages of progressive versus tax systems, and I'm just going to run through a few. First, and paradoxically, if tax rates are set at higher levels than individuals and companies consider fair, then that will lead to a lowering of the tax take. And we saw that the reverse of that playing out in New Zealand. In the early 1980s, in 1981, individual corporate income tax rate for non-residents, for resident companies was 45%, and for non-resident companies it was 50%. 20 years later, when corporate tax rates were lowered to 33%, the share of company taxes making up the total tax take had trebled from 5% to 15%. So there weren't the same incentives for companies to try to avoid tax when the tax rate was set at a level that was considered to be fair. A US president said, it's a paradoxical truth that tax rates are too high today and tax revenues are too low, and the soundest way to raise revenues in the long run is to cut rates now. You might think that was Ronald Reagan. It wasn't. It was President John F. Kennedy in 1962. And we saw that play out in New Zealand. When we cut tax rates in the late 1980s and early 1990s, companies started paying more tax. Now, we heard something from the economist on the panel about, or for the affirmative, about a justification or a supposed justification for having progressive tax rates, so higher tax rates on higher incomes based on the diminishing marginal utility of income. There isn't really a sound basis for determining on a society-wide basis how much utility diminishes, and it'll change for different people. And without a sound principle basis for setting rates higher on higher levels of income, it's unlikely to be, any system is unlikely to be sustainable, because it'll be unlikely to be accepted. And that's why we see across the world a tendency for progressive tax rates to be lowered. Even in the absence of people changing their affairs to avoid tax when progressive rates are increased, high progressive tax rates haven't proved to be very effective means of raising taxes. in New Zealand, only 2% of individuals earn over $150,000. And that's why the Labour government's proposal, the Labour Party's proposal, even after 6 years of national, it's hard not to say Labour government after 9 years of Clark and Cullen. But the Labour Party's proposal to increase the highest marginal tax rate from 33 to 36% is projected to raise only $200 million worth of revenue, which is a tiny fraction of the $18 billion worth of income tax that's raised. And that's because there's just only a very small number of high income earners. So that if you want to raise a significant amount of income tax, or to try to raise a significant amount of tax from the highest income earners by steeply progressive tax rates, you've got to raise the tax rates a lot. And when you raise the tax rates a lot, you get the dynamic effects, people restructuring their affairs or voting with their feet, as Francis said. So the real engine for income tax distribution in most countries is not the progressivity in the tax rates. It's the fact that the more you earn, the more you pay, and so it's the flat taxes in their own right will provide the mechanism for governments to pay for the institutions of government and to achieve the income redistribution goals the government might have. And then finally, there's overwhelming evidence that the larger the share of GDP consumed by tax, the lower the rate of growth an economy will enjoy. And studies suggest that if you reduce the share of government spending from 40% to 30% of GDP, it's worth between 0.5% and 1% of GDP growth a year. So whether tax rates are flat or progressive, the story from economics is that less is more. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Julie. Thank you to Roger for your comments, especially as I like the comments around references to Austrian economics, Eugen von Bloom-Barberg, from Jesus. Their work on capital formation is well worth rediscovering. And I really like Roger's comment on the temporary nature of taxes. We know, of course, there's nothing as permanent as a temporary tax. I think the cases you mentioned of income tax is a very good one. Previously, my favorite example was actually the German sparkling wine tax that was introduced in Imperial Germany to pay for the fleet. Well, the fleet was sunk in the First World War. The Germans are still paying taxes for sparkling wine today. We now have time for a couple of questions before we give it to the adjudicators. So if you'd like to direct your questions to either of our panelists.
Well, this is a debate, so I was kind of disappointed with Roger and Julie. I mean, they're giving the initiative line on lower taxes and everything, but of course we all believe that and kind of know it. But this is a debate. I think the debaters were fantastic. They got to the core issue, which is driving this tax debate, that people look to make an assessment, a psychological assessment of how deserving the rich are. And that's at the heart of some of the very latest sort of behavioural economics on this. Across the world, people are looking, is this rich guy deserved it, or is he corrupt and a thief? And in countries where there's a perception that the rich have got there through bribery, corruption, they go after them hard with much higher taxes and try to regulate them more. And that's what the public demand is in those kinds of countries, and we see steeply progressive taxes. In countries, New Zealand's pretty much one, very low corruption, if there's a sense that the rich have got there through hard work and deserve it, there seems a much lower demand from the public to go after them.
No, I agree with it.
Well, there was a point that was raised that wasn't rebutted around the use of infrastructure in the economy by people that earn more, when in fact our biggest spend is in the health sector in the economy, and it's in fact lower socioeconomic groups that tend to draw on the health system and the corrections system and also the education system, because wealthy people tend to send their children to private schools. I'm not saying that's all a good thing, but I'm just saying there was an opportunity to rebut that argument in quite a solid way.
Particularly go to private hospitals because they can afford to rather than waiting for public hospital waiting lists.
Yeah, well, no, that's right, but I'm just saying in terms of use of infrastructure. I mean, the other point is progressive systems never sit on their own. They always normally sit with indirect tax systems complementing them. While I disagree with the argument, you could actually say that indirect tax systems are significantly regressive at the early point. I mean, I believe that once you're retired, you spend all your money and they're not so regressive, but you know, a progressive system doesn't sit on its own, so you can look at the mix of taxes as to whether or not it's actually fair or not.
Would you like to comment on
I'd love to agree with that as well.
that? In which case, I think
I was rather hoping to hear somebody advocating for expenditure tax and the total abolition of income tax and even company tax. Is that a system that could work? Just to me, not much of an expert, I just think it hard to bring in. Transitionary might be hard, but I kind of think it's a good principle.
Yeah, no, look, I'm drawn to that as well. I don't think it's a regressive tax. It's one of those taxes, the more you spend, the more you pay. So it's got elements of regression. And also, as Alan said, once you spend, if you spend all your income in retirement, you spend all your income and you pay tax on it. So I think, well, we saw a lowering of income tax rates when GST was introduced in New Zealand, and it was done as part of the package. If we had a more efficient state, I suspect you could fund the state with 15% general goods and services tax and low or no income tax rates. After all, 15% on everything consumed is quite a big tax.
Like absolutely everything. No loopholes.
Because a consumption tax is viewed as the best tax by many of the best economists in the world. And these super rich people you're talking about, a lot of them are saving most of their money. Like Julian says, it's adding to capital accumulation and higher wages. They're not even spending it. So the consumption tax is fantastic. If you want someone's buying their super yachts and that, you know, okay, you can slap it on that. But there are a lot of very wealthy people that are just contributing a lot to the economy, and good on them.
I just never hear it debated.
Yeah.
In the
Yeah.
well, I believe all of us already
You
leads.
don't hear a debate about who's paying the tax. See, if I'm on the payroll, for every dollar that I make, I pay tax. If I'm not on the payroll, and maybe I'm a dairy farmer, I don't pay a lot of tax. Now, Miller and Bodigliani will tell us that the value of the firm is irrelevant to its capital structure. And then we discover, no, that capital structure matters. And why? Perhaps because of the tax distortion, the treatment of debt. So these are some very important issues. And I, as an economist too, I will fully agree that I much prefer, for fairness reasons, an expenditure tax. Because it seems that in this country, where maybe 20% of people have houses, for example, worth well over $1 million, there are only less than 2% that make $150,000 or more. How do you explain that? Somebody is not paying taxes, not illegally. Well, we have some huge distortions.
Well, I'm actually all in favour of no one paying taxes, so because that leads to capital accumulation, which actually is, as I said, great for the poorest people in society. So I think this might be something that we can work with. I mean, my points are up in front were around, and I mentioned Thomas Piketty because I think it's a very, very destructive book that he's put out. And despite what the intelligentsia says, the people who will be most hurt by the book will be the poorest people in society. Over the next generations. And that's why I think it's a great topic for the debate and to become aware of its impact on capital accumulation.
I think you're absolutely right. It is the poor tax pot, it is the poor, the weak, the vulnerable who suffer the most. They're the ones who are least likely to be able to vote with their feet. They don't have the qualifications, the capital to make them attractive to overseas countries. Whereas, you know, don't hit the lawyers too much, lawyers, doctors, accountants, people with either skills and or capital, they're the ones that can and frankly do to move to Australia. You know, they almost speak the same language, Britain, the UK, countries are similar, and they're the ones who can and do vote with their feet.
They do almost speak the same language. Now, I think we'll leave it here. I want to see whether any of the points we just discussed are featuring in what the adjudicators made of this debate. So I would like to ask one of the adjudicators to deliver the verdict now.
Thank you, Dr. Partridge, and of course to the both teams for what we thought was a very entertaining debate, and I did appreciate having some clarifications. I've written my decision down before I came into the room, so as I was not swayed by some of the excellent analysis from some of the participants following. Look, I'm up here today as the only non-practicing, and my colleagues advised me, reformed lawyer. The other two were too offended to come up to limit this adjudication after some of the abusive remarks from the negating team. There was also some commentary from my fellow junior lawyers as to whether or not they thought their practice so far at least led to the land of milk and honey that they were promised. I'm sure they'll continue to work hard and they'll get there eventually. Look, we saw this debate coming down really to two issues, and I intend to keep this reasonably brief. Of course, there was a lot more discussion we could do, but for the purpose of a quick adjudication and returning beverages at the back, we'll keep this at two issues. So the first question was how much of the income you earn you should get to keep. We were persuaded on this point that of course you should get to keep some of it, but not necessarily all of it, and that it would be acceptable for there to be an element of progressivity for that. And there were two reasons which we agreed with the negating team on that front for. The first being a question of privilege, and we thought the affirmative team had some sophisticated tax on this particular point in terms of whether or not you could have a system of tax that identified, and perhaps I'm taking some of the negating team's language that over-characterised and pushed the burden a bit hard on the affirmative side, but some model that could establish everyone's individual privilege and tax them according to that. We did think, though, that in terms of a blunt mechanism for dealing with elements of privilege, that there were some real merits to a progressive taxation model which supported its fairness. The other component of that was, I guess, the next layer of the argument, which was the disproportionate benefit that the negating team told us that those who received extra income achieved due to the access to social infrastructure that they disproportionately benefited from. So they used the roads more because they owned more capital driving trucks back and forth. And we thought that was some helpful additional analysis from the negating team that convinced us on that first question that a progressive taxation regime was the fairest way to determine how much of your income you should get to keep. So the second question then were really what were the effects of the regime, because we thought that was also important to determining what was fair. So what justified the change to you as an individual and what you benefit from was the first argument, but second of all, what impact it had on the rest of society. And we thought there were two important issues to address here. First, the question of marginal utility. We had an economic argument and a philosophical argument. I won't go into detail, but we accepted that those who earned more needed the extra money a bit less than those who earned less. So it was appropriate to have a redistributive system, and a progressive system was a fair way of doing that, both on the economics and on the philosophy. And finally, the flow-on effect of that was a correction for the existing inequality that the negating team painted for us, and indeed the affirmative team, when they talked about the different privilege that people come to the table with, we accepted existed, and we were optimistic at least that would mean more minority or lower decile school members in the New Zealand schools debating team, and we also wouldn't lose out on Twitter or other innovations. We heard those existed already, and I will finally say, importantly, we won't miss out on that important investment in telecommunications infrastructure, which I also think is particularly important. So on that basis, we gave the debate by a reasonably clear margin to the negating team.
Congratulations to the University of Auckland. I would like to thank all of our debaters, Olivia Hall, Alec Dawson, Paul Smith and James Penn, for their contributions to the debate. I think it was an excellent debate. I'd like to thank our adjudicators, Leslie Horton, Mitchell Cooper and Stephanie Thompson, for coming up with their verdict. I'd like to thank our panelists, Roger Partridge and Julian Darby, for their contributions to the debate and sharing some ideas on an optimal tax system with us. And finally, I'd like to thank Michael Friedland and his foundation for sponsoring this tournament and for EY for hosting us tonight. That's all for us from tonight. We'll have a second semi-final tomorrow in Wellington. We'll have a grand final next week in Wellington. But for tonight, we're adjourned, and I would like to ask you all to join us for drinks and nibbles outside. Thank you very much.